provoking testimony on this important topic. Mr. Augustine, you'd mentioned in your written testimony that you were present at the creation, so to speak, of In-Q-Tel back in the 1990s. I'm familiar with the organization from my work on the Intelligence Committee. Could you give us your take on the lessons learned from the creation of In-Q-Tel and the way it's worked and how it would apply to the Department of Defense, given their differences in mission and scale and so forth?
Yes, I don't believe that In-Q-Tel can solve the broad problems of the Department of Defense, but I think a Department of Defense version of In-Q-Tel to deal with very high priority specific challenges could be very valuable. And the secret to In-Q-Tel is fairly straightforward, and that is that it has the capability to deal with firms just as they would deal with each other, as opposed to the way they have to deal with the government. And In-Q-Tel had a lot of latitude, a lot of flexibility. Is there room for abuse? Yes, but thus far there's not been a problem.
Okay. Mr. Fitzgerald, the interaction between the Department of Defense and the private sector, especially given that technological development is now largely located outside of our defense industry, is something about which you wrote. You said there needed to be policy, legal, cultural changes in your written testimony. Do you care to comment on the In-Q-Tel approach? You had some comments earlier, but also what Mr. Augustine just said.
I think that the In-Q-Tel model is an excellent one. A number of the advantages that it is based on are particular to the intelligence community. Partially that's about size, and it's also about their ability to link the people who own the problem with the people who fund the solution very quickly. And it's difficult for us to do that in the Department of Defense. So I think that it helps us address a number of challenges. The challenge for the Department of Defense is how do you do that at scale? So that's how we can build prototypes. That's how we can get new entrants into the marketplace. But we don't have a good model yet to take us from that new idea into a large program of record, which isn't the failing of In-Q-Tel or those models. It's a failure of our program of record system.
Okay. When you say that the Department of Defense is going to need legal and policy and cultural changes, which one of those do you think are most important?
Ultimately, it's the cultural change, but that's probably going to be driven in the first instance by the law and policy. And I think the other factor, something that we've talked about significantly today, is about leadership and human capital. So ultimately, I think, and I think this has been shown in our testimony and the understanding of the community today, we know what most of the challenges are. And we have a pretty good idea of what needs to be done. It's just a question of how do we move the large institutions to implement on what we know needs to be done.
And Colonel Ward, the human capital and leadership development is something about which you spoke in your written testimony, specifically the ability of constraint-driven teams to innovate rapidly at lower cost. What's your perspective on this, about the cultural or mindset shift that may need to occur?
Absolutely. So the culture shift, I agree, is absolutely the right piece of the puzzle that's going to be have the biggest impact on improving acquisition outcomes. And when I say acquisition outcomes, I mean programmatically as well as operationally. So the ability to get the mission done on time, on budget. The culture shift, I think right now we have a culture that tends to look at complexity as a sign of sophistication, budgets as a sign of prestige, and long timelines as a sign of strategic intelligence and strategic genius. When in fact, I think we get better results when we have a culture that values speed, thrift, and simplicity. I think the other piece of it too, though, is, and we talked a lot about regulations, I found that ignorance of the FAR is a greater barrier to innovation than the regulations themselves. The prevailing perception in the culture is the FAR won't let you do that. The FAR won't let you be fast. The FAR won't let you simplify. In fact, when we go through and read the FAR, and there's plenty of clauses, plenty of pieces of the FAR that do not only allow but encourage speed, thrift, and simplicity. So a greater awareness of what the FAR actually says, what it allows, what it encourages, I think could go a long way towards that. And it's just a matter of,
what's behind that lack of awareness among people who, by and large, make a living using the FAR?
Right, it's so big and so expensive, or the FAR itself is so complex that it's intimidating. I found that people who can quote the FAR chapter and verse tend to be more convincing than people who can't, and the people who can quote the FAR chapter and verse are very, very few in number. It's easier to just say the FAR, which none of us have read, doesn't let you do that. And so it's a safer, it's a more risk-averse type approach to just say, well, I'm sure we can't do that because we didn't do it last time.
The military, by and large, has an up-or-out personnel management system. Do you think that's an appropriate system for the people who are involved in our acquisitions process?
That is a challenging and problematic. I'm not sure I have a better solution for it. But in my case, for example, I did decide to retire from the military because I was not interested in getting promoted again. I wasn't interested in moving again. My kids were heading into high school and we wanted them to start and finish in one place. And the Air Force's perspective was either move or get out. There was no third option to sort of stay and keep doing this kind of work.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you. On behalf of the chairman, Senator McCaskill.